Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Riley. I'm the Director of Public Engagement at Bard Graduate Center. It's really a pleasure to welcome you to today's event, which is the first in a series of programs about upcoming exhibitions at BGC. So hopefully we'll give you an insight into what's coming and also some more information on how we make exhibitions at BGC and how uh, our exhibitions are in process. Before we start, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we are hosting this event from today. So, while we have the privilege of convening virtually today, we also have the responsibility to acknowledge that many cities and institutions in America were founded on the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous people, including those on whose land, Mannahatta, from which we're hosting this event today. The land of the five boroughs that make up New York City are the traditional homelands of the Lenape, Merrick, Canarsie, Matinecock, and Rockaway nations. Despite systemic erasures, these lands persist as intertribal lands under the stewardship of many nations and over 115,000 intertribal Native American, First Nations, and Indigenous people who currently call New York City home. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge those whose ancestors did not arrive on these lands of their own free will and whose tremendous cultural, economic, and technological contributions continue to provide the foundations for our lives. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand it over to Sun Kai Po, who's going to introduce you to conserving active matter. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Emily, for those introductory words. My name is Sun Kai Po, and I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Conservation as a Human Science postgraduate fellow here at the Bard Graduate Center. I am educated and trained as an objects conservator, and today it is my pleasure to introduce Conserving Active Matter, an upcoming exhibition at the Bard Graduate Center, which is slated to open in the spring of 2022. Conserving Active Matter is the culmination of a 10-year-long initiative at the BGC to bring together and foster conversations between the humanities and scholars of material culture with conservators and broadly the field of conservation. The exhibition itself is a project that has drawn in numerous voices and was conceived from the very beginning as a collaborative effort, developed out of conversations and discussions with a curatorial team that includes multiple faculty at the Bard Graduate Center with interests and expertise in the fields of archaeology, history, philosophy, material science, and anthropology. And so on behalf of the curatorial team, I'm also grateful to our numerous collaborators who are conservators, artists, and scholars for the time and generosity to guide us in the selection of the items in the exhibition and to think through the opportunities they present with us. So in many ways, the exhibition is really enriched by the narrative brought to the table through their input. And I know that some of you are here today. Thank you for being here. And also that many of these collaborators have participated in one or more events as part of this broader Cultures of Conservation initiative in the past. And so in many ways, the exhibition is a homecoming of sorts for us. With that, I'd like to tell you a bit more about the exhibition itself. The exhibition explores the activity of matter through items that span 5 continents and range in time from the Paleolithic to the present, from the things that clothe us, the things that physically cover and shelter us, from things that reflect our interest in the past and those that enable its performance in the present, from sacred items to the profane. This exhibition really envisions the work of conservation as that which is essential for the lives of things that sustain us as people. And so we take a broad look at this effort to conserve things as part of the persistent human struggle with the pervasive activity of matter. And in many ways, for as long as people have made things and kept things, they've also cared for them and repaired them. And today, conservators use a variety of tools and categories developed over the last 150 years to do this work. But in the future, in the upcoming decades, new kinds of materials are being developed and a new scale of change on the level of the globe, really, in the form of climate change will pose new challenges for conservation. And so as conservators increasingly turn to an expanding set of constituencies, collaborators, and knowledge claims to do this work, how might we consider our roles in conserving such active matter and in conversations about environmental and cultural sustainability? And so this is the title slide. The exhibition is organized into 4 sections, and each responding to a prompt, a question. What is conservation? How are things active? Who acts on objects? When and why? And where is the future of conservation? And before I go further into sort of introducing some of the highlights in the exhibition, I'll just sort of lay the groundwork for today's event. So I'll very briefly talk about the broad narrative arc of the exhibition before spending some time thinking about and talking about the coursework that's ongoing at the Bard Graduate Center. And this project is really one that involves graduate students in its creation, and they have very much been a part of its shaping. And then we'll also talk a bit about, I'll also talk a bit about the opportunities I think that curating an exhibition like this presents, particularly when its sort of central theme is that of conservation. And then in sort of the closing 10, 15 minutes, I'll invite Dean Peter Miller, who is one of the faculty members on this curatorial team and who has spearheaded the Cultures of Conservation initiative over the past 9 years, to speak with me a little bit about sort of the exhibition and to contextualize it within this initiative. So with that, I will begin. And so the exhibition really opens with an item, in this case, a Paleolithic stone hand axe that we're very excited about from the Vondervoort cave in South Africa. It dates to approximately 1 million years ago. And why it's interesting to us, it's not very big, as you can see from the scale bar, is that it bears evidence of reworking at a later point from when it was first made. And for us, it is a very evocative example of how literally for as long as people have existed and for as long as we've made things and used them, we have also made efforts to repair them, to rework them such that they continue to sustain us. And this is sort of leading us into this broad framework of conservation that we're introducing. In a sort of more mechanical level, perhaps, we're also interested in articulating, showing the range of ways in which we have done this repair and restorative work. Here with the example of ceramics, again, from a wide variety of contexts, but with different methods of repair and mending. So on the left, with the Japanese technique of kintsugi or gold lacquer repairs, ceramics mended with lacquer and surfaced with gold, that in fact improves the value of these formerly broken pieces. But then also the addition of silver fittings by tinkers and silversmiths, as well as that of mending ceramics with the use of metal staples you see on the right. One particularly, I think, exciting and interesting example for us are that of Vai Asande Society masks. And in particular, the contrast between that of the Bundu masks and those of the Gande mask. In this case, when Bundu masks, which are used in ceremonial performances to introduce the presence of the Sove, when they are in disrepair, and they may either be structurally restored such that their function can continue to be perpetuated, or they may be transformed in the process of decercalization by the addition of pigment. In this case, the process of conservation isn't restorative, it is transformative. But in both instances, responding to the activity of matter, as I mentioned earlier. We think of the practices of conservation writ large as being impelled by practices of collecting and the formation of collections. And here, just showing a print of depicting Olivarm's Museum Wormianum from 1653, a Wunderkammer, a cabinet of curiosities, that was later reinterpreted by the artist Rosamund Purcell in 2011 in her installation All Things Strange and Beautiful, that itself is a form of conservation of these collections. We're also interested in showing, and I'm not showing the screen here today, examples of collecting in a vernacular and a demotic sense. What I mean here are the things that we as people collect, whether they may be your favorite coffee mug, the silver that has been passed down in your family through generations, or Pokemon cards or baseball cards, which I understand over the course of the pandemic have seen a resurgence of interest, and also the efforts in which we have taken to preserve them. And so really for us, the formation of collections itself as an act of preservation, but also that when things are collected, they impel and they require preservation too. And so very quickly, we turn to two examples in this first gallery, which we're interested in to tell the story of the professionalization of conservation in Euro-America, but also as it has hybridized with approaches elsewhere. And so a portrait of a young man, which is an unfinished painting, in fact, by the artist, attributed to artist Bernardino Lucchino from the Howard University Gallery of Art, as well as the Nigatsudo Bronze Sutra from Japan, presently at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And in both instances, they may appear to us as paintings. On the one hand, sort of the contrasts are quite evident, that of a Renaissance Western painting on panel, on the right, a Japanese painting. In this case, in fact, a hand scroll that has been later reformatted as a hanging scroll. What we're interested in telling the story of here is the questions that the conservators of these items ask through their work. What is the painting? How do we learn of their histories? What tools and methods do we apply to this work? And how might we relate with the actions of others who have preceded us? And so really for us, these two, the comparison or really the contrast of these two paintings here articulate and sort of preview the next three galleries in the exhibition. In the second gallery, we ask the question, how are things active? And I'm going to kind of speed through this bit right here, just to say that here we're interested in thinking about, well, if matter is active, how is it so? And in a material sense, we're familiar, or perhaps more familiar with glass deteriorating in burial environments near and far. We're familiar with wood that weathers as a result of exposure to its environment, ceramics in a context of a shipwreck underwater, the use of iron gall ink in letters, papers that fade, and so on. But I think what's interesting for us is to also situate this together and alongside examples of material activity that might be less familiar to us. On the left, in this case, a Sioux pipe made, in this case, the pipe itself made of caplanite. And for the Sioux, the stone from which these pipes are made are infused with power and charged with power and active in this way, having sort of material activity beyond sort of that which we bring to from the scientific perspective. In the center, in fact, is the same Hopi ceramic canteen, and I should mention here that we've been guided in the selection of these canteens, and they're not ritual vessels, but that for the Hopi, that clay is a living material, and upon its firing, these canteens become social beings, and in this sense, for us, they are an example again of material activity, not just from the scientific sense, but also from indigenous ways of knowing. On the right, a Korean shaman painting depicting a guardian god. In this case, the sort of recreation of this guardian god was in fact painted from memory, another form of conservation, thinking about ways of sort of preserving the activity of matter. And here, I think what's really fascinating, as with all of the things and all of the items that I will show today, is that while we may think of their activity, or while it is possible to interpret their activity in different ways, fundamentally they contain material activities of their own. And here, the use of fluorescent pigments that may deteriorate or change with light exposure in ways which may not be intuitive to us at first glance. And what about performative works? And I've talked so far about material traces, really, things and items from which we glean their activity as a result of time. But what about things and works which are in time? And on the left, Feliz Gonzalez Torres's Untitled Death by Gun, which exists as an installation piece, and in this case, it's a stack of sheets of paper with the pictures of people who were victims of gun death in 1990. And the audience and the visitors are invited to remove these sheets of paper when they visit the exhibition. But the work itself doesn't exist for its institution, in this case, the Museum of Modern Art, in the form of paper. It exists as a digital file, which has its own challenges of preservation and active in that way. And on the right, a photograph of Touching North, a series of snow sculptures by the artist Andy Goldsworthy that he created at the North Pole in 1989. And here again, as a sort of ephemeral artwork, how is it preserved? And in this case, it is preserved in the form of its photographic documentation. In the third gallery, we asked the question, who acts on objects, when and why? And here we're interested in thinking about conservation as a series of actions that occur and not just with the material, which we are, I think, accustomed to think of, but also with time, which may be intuitive, and that conservators really, in the present, work with a past that they discover and imagine for a perceived future, and that these actions are necessarily temporally contextualized. And so we've thought of the items in this gallery along the lines of how activity has been a part or not a part of their being, perhaps at the moment of creation or use, and later on at a different time, valued or not valued, and to highlight conservation as the process that works at the nexus of these trajectories. And so here I'm showing a 19th century policyware platter in the collection of the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, where there have been multiple phases of restoration. And in its most recent conservation treatment, the conservator elected to improve a fill that was done on the platter, but to leave intact other traces of restoration. So you can't see it in this image here, but on its underside in particular, there's evidence of metal staples that hold it together. Other traces left by users are often also preserved, and in some cases may even supersede the value of the piece itself. And here we're very excited to show Vladimir Nabokov's copy of Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, published in 1946. This is the translation published in 1946, I should say, from the New York Public Library with his annotations in the margins. And here, the actions of another person, in this case Nabokov, in the life of the book, has added to it, and in this case, it's preserved by its conservators into the future. Other examples of items in this gallery include the work Electric Life by the artist Teresa Van Dongen, where care and ongoing maintenance is very much part of its being. Here, what is less evident perhaps in the images is that in this chamber, in the middle of the sculpture, are electroactive bacteria that has to be constantly and consistently fed on a weekly basis, such that they continue to generate light, which is visible through these lenses at the top. And so for this particular work, care and maintenance is very much a part of its being and will continue to be, as is the case for Always Becoming, an artwork by a site-specific installation at the National Museum of American Indian by the artist Nora Naranjo Morse. And we're still in conversation with Nora and her daughter Eliza as to its interpretation in our galleries. But here, where from the very get-go, conservation was included and sort of conceived of in its creation. And so these clay sculptures are intended to be stewarded through their ongoing return to the ground, as it were. And that its conservation over the years has brought in an increasingly large community of collaborators, and in this case, people who are charged with its preservation. And here, again, much like Electric Life, in a very different way, care is a part of this act of working with time and with the material in time. In the final gallery, we're asking the question, where is the future of conservation? Given that we've explored how conservation works with material and with time, it comes back to, I think, people and to us as individuals, as communities and as societies. Here, I'm showing an example of, this is not the final item that will be in the exhibition, but an example of it that highlights the work of Sven Haakensen and his collaborators to study gut-skin boat models in institutional collections around the world to learn of their making and processes of craft, such that they may continue to be revitalized in the present. And indeed, prior to Sven's study of these models, this knowledge had been lost. And here, having an impact not just on the conservation of knowledge, but also of communities. And in the future, we're also faced and confronted with materials that have activity not as sort of a byproduct of their being, but very much as activity as central to what they are. And here are material sensitive apertures, and these are really prototypes that suggest how we might, in fact, rather than restrain wood or expect wood to be a static material, work with the way in which it responds to its surrounding environment with changing humidities and temperatures in order to create architectural scale structures that we are sheltered by. And if activity is the goal and not stabilization, say, or stasis, what will the conservation of these materials look like? And so in a sort of very brief nutshell, I've kind of run through several highlights in the exhibition. And I also want to take some time to talk about the coursework that has happened over the past semester with 11 students at the Bard Graduate Center. And so the exhibition project has, again, from its inception, been conceived of as a way in which to bring exhibition making into the classroom. And students have been tasked with the writing of textual interpretation for some of the items that will be in the exhibition, in addition to thinking about their spatial interpretation. And so we have been working with our exhibition designer to think of how these spaces and how these items will be displayed in the galleries at the Bard Graduate Center. And so as part of this effort, one of the sort of tasks, and I'm going to just flash through these on the screen, are mood boards that students have created that respond to each of the prompts of the galleries. And so here are sort of 3 samples from What is Conservation? And these guide us to thinking about what these spaces could look like, at least on the conceptual level. Are they about mystery? Are they about discovery? About different ways of seeing, for example, about practices of and forms of organization and categorization? How are objects active? We might think of, in this case, the ability to look at things under ultraviolet light. How might we incorporate that into the experience of the exhibition? Our response to sort of ruins and history in our immediate environment. For example, who acts on objects, when and why? And so you'll realize that none of these mood boards look alike. And I think in our conversations and discussions that we've had in class, we've talked about how they all draw out these themes in different ways. And finally, where's the future of conservation? Oh, actually, I had a blank slide in here, but I'll just continue to say a little bit, I think, about the opportunities that this really brings. And on the one hand, I should mention that I've thus far introduced the exhibition with conservation really as its backbone. And we're thinking about these 4 questions about conservation that guide us across this narrative arc, but that we really envision other pathways that we can take with this material. We could, for example, imagine visitors looking at objects that are all looking at textile objects across this trajectory and how each of them speak to the prompts of each of the galleries. And that gets us to an interesting point, especially in the thinking of how to situate different items in the galleries, which is that for each of them, they can all speak to each of these 4 questions in different ways. Each of the items can speak to what is conservation, how might it be active, who acts on it, when and why, and how does it sort of prompt us to think about the future of conservation. And so some of these possibilities we are exploring through the use of our exhibition website that will allow us to kind of overlay, and we've thought of this sort of with the metaphor of a woven textile, with conservation as the warp in these different narratives as the weft that intertwine. And we're looking forward to developing them in the course that will happen, the second of these courses that will happen in the fall with students at the BGC. You also notice that the items that I've shown you run a very wide and sort of an almost eclectic range of contexts, and which are not often shown together, but I think for conservators are easy in some ways to relate to, given that one of the ideas that inspired us was a conversation we had early on, which is that the conservator's studio or lab is very much a serendipitous one. You never sort of exclusively work on a single kind of material or a single kind of artifact at any one time, and you're constantly in conversation with yourself as you are with the things around you in the work that you do. And so we're interested in the contrast and the questions raised by these contrasts between these items. And I think what's really exciting is that we're making an exhibition about conservation. And traditionally, conservation has been in the service of the exhibition medium. And what does it mean to invert this for the exhibition to be in service of, in this case, the topic of conservation? How might we use the language of conservation to tell its own story? And here we've been in really interesting and engaging discussions in class to think about how, for example, the identifying information for items in the exhibition could include their conservation histories, could include not sort of as an afterthought, the people or the communities that might have been a part of their ongoing becoming. And how might we get visitors to not just see as conservators might and things, but also to get them to think as a conservator might. And so I've talked a bit about how with the two examples of the Italian painting and the sutra that has been mounted as a hanging scroll to introduce ways of knowing and ways of learning about these items. How might we represent sort of what I would like to call the conservation ephemera that is generated, the conservation treatment reports, the technical analysis, images, results into the exhibition. And that is, I think, a challenge and a welcome opportunity for us with the design of the galleries. And I think to kind of tie this back to the broad arc of the aims and objectives of the exhibition, really to allow visitors to think of themselves in some ways as conservators, and that, you know, in the future, with changes and activity on these different scales, and as we continue to navigate the relationships between us and objects and think about our expectations of them, that we will all need conservation in one way or another, and what are the expanded roles that the conservation might take in the future. So I think it is very enticing to think of conservation, if you allow me to make this terrible pun, as the glue that binds the fields of inquiry and material culture that I introduced at the very beginning, that represent the sort of interdisciplinary collaboration that has resulted in this exhibition from history, anthropology, archaeology, material science, philosophy, how conservation can be the glue that brings them together. And I think that's the hope that we bring to the planning of this exhibition. So I'll next ask Dean Peter Miller to join me on screen. Hi, Peter.
Thanks, Kai.
And I mentioned at the very beginning of today's event that the exhibition is the culmination of a 10-year-long initiative at the BGC to bring together and to foster these conversations. So I think we'll just have a few sort of, I guess, minutes of conversation, and then to open it up to the audience to ask and any questions that they might have. But, you know, I'm hoping that you could reflect perhaps a little bit from your perspective how this Cultures of Conservation initiative has animated the intellectual environment at the BGC, and how has it evolved over the past 9 years or so?
Sure, thanks, Kai. And it's always wonderful listening to you present. I mean, I think the initiative that you mentioned, the Cultures of Conservation, actually, it isn't just concluded in a kind of formal way with the exhibition, but I think the exhibition actually concretizes a lot of what the initiative was about. You know, the initiative, as you said, is about bringing conservators, conservation scientists, and conservation knowledge into our institutional conversation, but more broadly into within the horizon of all those who study the past through things, material culture, decorative arts, design history. It was about, in a sense, recognizing conservators and conservation scientists as equal participants in an inquiry, not as marginal or subservient or subordinate to others, but as people with knowledge that was necessary and part of an ongoing conversation. So in a sense, you could see it in the first instance as broadening out the world of material culture studies to include voices that were not part of it or not enough part of it before. As we worked through those implications, we also realized that there were, looking in the other direction, aspects of what we were doing that that could really affect the doing of conservation itself. And we tried to step gingerly here because no one likes to be told what to do, but we really felt that with the knowledge that conservators had, what they were given in their training and then their professional experience, they could really tackle different kinds of problems and be part of the solution of different kinds of problems. So for instance, just take you, not to make you feel uncomfortable, but it was important for us that this exhibition be curated by a conservator, right? The curator-conservator division, and I'm not going to talk more about it now, seemed to us something that could be transcended, that there was no in principle reason why someone with the great kind of training you got at the Institute across the park couldn't also tackle a show. And so in a way, just like in our curriculum and in our events, we're trying to model a future as an academic institution. Part of our care, like the motto of Hunter College, the city of New York, mine is the care for the future. Well, that's true of all academic institutions. So thinking about the future of conservation, it's people like you and your colleagues whom we've met over the course of these 9 years. So that's one thing that we've really tried hard to do. But the exhibition itself tries to do that, not just in the it's in not just in presenting the conservator's work, but in presenting the conservator's thinking, right? That the conservator is not just a pair of hands, but it's a pair of hands connected to a very well-trained and sensitive mind. And that with that, in turn, the kinds of questions that conservators can help solve, participate in the discussions about, that's the section on the future, there's a much bigger horizon of possibility than up to now has been acknowledged or really taken advantage of. And then, looking across to our colleagues in the humanities, part of what we're doing with this show, and it's again comes out of the initiative, is to make very clear that conservation is a fundamental human experience. We may think of lots of other experiences as human ones, but conservation typically, has not been seen as such. We might talk about memory, we might talk about care, we might talk about love. All those things come together in conservation. And once you flip things like that, then you find conservation, not just a million years ago, as you were saying, but you find it represented across the human experience. So for instance, the Staffordshire plate that you show in the first slide on mending, I mean, I'm sure those of you in the audience looking at this immediately thought of stitches on a human body. And indeed, that's one of the things that we've thought about. An operating room is like a conservation studio or laboratory. And that kind of flash of recognition in visitors to the show is one of the things that we're trying to achieve.
I think something you said, Peter, really resonated with me, and I think in some of the conversations that we've had, I think you framed it as, well, can we not think of history as a form of conservation, or conservation as a form of practicing history? And I think, just speaking for myself as very much an emerging professional and young conservator in terms of experience, it's been really fruitful to think about the actions and the kinds of decisions that are taken by conservators in some ways on a very material, very kind of relatable way, but to see them in different and broader contexts of inquiry. And I think it would be, I might have mentioned this to you, but I think it would be fascinating to think about what this might mean for sort of the ongoing education and training of conservators in terms of the sort of fields of inquiry that they might, I guess, need to understand or want to understand better to continue to do this work into the future.
Yeah, I mean, interdisciplinarity has to be a two-way street, right? And I think, speaking as a humanist, there hasn't been enough of reaching out to conservators. But I would dare say that there hasn't been enough of a reaching out by conservators to the humanists either. Up to now, and those in the audience who know better can surely correct me, it seems to me that the conversations of conservators have been mostly with art historians, whether in universities or in museums, the curators. And I think that there's a bigger conversation to be had. For me, my kind of realization that history is a form of conservation, and then running with it, and this will be one of the articles in the exhibition catalog that we're doing online, that came from actually watching the string of conservators come to BGC in the early years of the project and talk about the past they were able to uncover by peeling away the layers on an object. And the stratigraphic metaphor immediately took me to archaeology. And the recognition that what conservators do is a form of archaeology of the object, and therefore a form of studying the past. At which point, it then dawned on me you could just flip that around and ask, well, isn't that what historians do when they write down the past? They are preserving it in the same way that Ole Worm did the taxidermy and then made a print. It's a kind of a twofold form of conservation. And of course, historians do the same thing. They gather up documents, preserve them, and then put them into stories, which is a second level form of preservation. So I think there's so much to learn once one starts to chase down, to track conservation all through the human experience. And I hope that our exhibition will provoke some of that.
Yeah, I want to return to something you said earlier, I think, which is this idea of collaboration across disciplines, and you referenced art history. And I cannot help but be reminded of some of our early discussions where we're thinking of, is the exhibition solely about conservation in the museum? And obviously, and to some degree, a lot of the examples that we're drawing from indeed come from collecting institutions where conservators work within those institutional and in many ways sort of disciplinary contexts. And I'm wondering from your perspective, sort of as the dean of the Bard Graduate Center, how you've been able to kind of think about this in a transdisciplinary way. And I'm just, in my mind, I'm just wondering, what might it mean for a conservation department at a museum to similarly make these moves in a broader, kind of more wide-ranging sense, to not think of, say, the work of conservation as strictly in service of the exhibition, say, or in service to our historical inquiry and other forms of inquiry too. And how might that happen? I don't know, it's just sort of a question that comes to mind.
So I think in a way, this project was easy for me to envision, even though, of course, you never envision the whole of a project, sort of like an early morning on a foggy day, that the fog recedes as you go into the day. It's the same with the project. But I would say that because the BGC is an institution that's not based on a discipline, but around a question, that is, how do you study the past through things, it's quite natural for us to acknowledge that there are different tools that you need depending on the particular shape of the local problem, whether the tools come from one discipline or another. And in a way, I think for a museum-based scholar, whether a curator or a conservator, part of the challenge is that of the relationship between museums and academia and universities. And obviously, it's not a problem that any one person can solve. But unlike libraries, museums are much more peripheral to the intellectual life of almost every institution. And partly that has to do with the fact that most academic institutions are organized around disciplines, not the BGC, but most academic institutions are. And museums are not disciplines. Museums are collections, and they are collections of solutions that are formulated by different individuals or communities over time in different parts of the world. They are, in a sense, collections of applied reflection. And as long as universities are based on pure disciplines, museums will always be somewhat extrinsic to them. But for places like the BGC that have questions, then museums are places to go for answers. And I think, interdisciplinary academic institutions are more likely to make better interlocutors for museums. And for those in museums seeking interlocutors, it's more likely to work with interdisciplinary institutions, I think, than with disciplinary ones, even though up to now it is true that art history has been much more interested in having that conversation than, say, history or anthropology. But times change.
So what you just mentioned makes me think of, I think we've conceived of them as opportunities with this exhibition, in that precisely because I think the exhibition is intended to be a medium to showcase this form of thinking and intellectual inquiry, and not strictly sort of for the performance or for the display of things to the public explicitly in that way, as a museum might, that we've been able to consider certain curatorial opportunities, risks, perhaps, if you want to think of it in that sense. And I'm wondering if you'll say a little bit about, what your thoughts are on the sort of way in which you conceive of exhibition making at the BGC as a tool, perhaps, and what that future of that might look like.
Well, that's a characteristically incisive question, and I'm not sure my answer will be up to the level of the question. I think we've been having a kind of institution-wide dialogue really around this question over the course of the year. And one of the most interesting comments I got, and I'm still not entirely sure how to process it, was that exhibiting is a way of thinking. And I'm trying to imagine what that entails. I mean, it's a way of thinking with things. It's a way of thinking in space. It's a way of thinking collaboratively. It could be a way of thinking about problem solving, like I was just saying before. For us, we try to integrate this type of creative project with our teaching to try and encourage the working out of this way of thinking in the classroom, to kind of, in a sense, break down the wall, or to lower the threshold between the kind of exploration that happens in a classroom and the kind that can happen in a gallery. I think there's always more that can be done. I was just having some conversations with students last night about how they were interested, for instance, in trying to find ways to bring into the classroom the kinds of work on interpretation that, for instance, you were talking about with the mood boards. So I think there's more to be done. It's an area where I don't think anyone has actually patented the one-size-fits-all solution to this question.
Great, thank you. I think we'll turn to taking some questions from the audience, and I see one from Hadley. How has teaching this semester shaped, challenged, or enlivened your own curatorial process? It's a great one, and I think I'm sort of brought back to about a month into the class, um, in the conversation and discussion that we had with students, and sort of to realize that what was really interesting about um, asking students to provide and to do the research for the textual and to think about the spatial interpretation of these items in the exhibition, or that we were asking them to do something that none of us on the curatorial team uh, had the ability to do, which was that we were approaching this project from our sort of individual disciplinary angles and perspectives. And we were asking them to draw from the sort of combination or the overlay of all of these perspectives to produce this interpretation and to conceive of the exhibition in this way. Um, and so I think their sort of reflections and takeaways that were brought into the class discussions have been very sort of informative in pointing out opportunities that we hadn't envisioned before. The mood boards are one that we're very excited to explore as a potential way to engage with visitors. The same for the rewriting or the exploration of how label text associated with items in the exhibition might be written. And so the prompt really was, given given what you have read about and learned about conservation over the course of the semester, and also what you've learned about the items that you're writing on, how might you reinterpret their sort of label text? How would you incorporate their conservation histories? And a variety of responses came out. And I think in that way, the students haven't just sort of been just passive participants in the process, but very much actively shaping what the exhibition looks like. We have another question from Chitra Ramalingam. Toward the end of the talk, suggested that visitors to the exhibition might think of themselves as conservators. Is this intended as a democratizing move? Conservation in the museum/heritage context is a practice anyone can participate in that others beyond expert museum professionals could or should have a stake in, or a universalizing move in our lives that we all participate in conservation as a fundamental human experience. If you are interested in the exhibition as a mechanism for democratizing conservation, then is there a participatory aspect to visitor engagement that you hope to foster in the exhibition? What could that look like? That is an excellent question. And I'm not sure my answer will address it very satisfactorily. And I'm going to also ask Peter to respond to this too. But I think instinctively, I think that the first point that it is a democratizing move is something that we're already seeing with museum institutions, particularly over the past year, but already in the sort of years leading up to today. And I would say both to some degree. That we intend this for us or for the visitors to be able to see the items in the exhibition and the kinds of processes of conservation that have been applied to them as one that is relatable to actions that they might perform in their own lives too. And I think throughout the exhibition, we have included items that call attention to this. The inclusion of say baseball cards, inclusion of photographs that were rescued from Hurricane Katrina, for example, and other examples that this professionalized activity may point us towards thinking about such processes, but it's not an exclusionary sort of way of practice. And then with sort of the really interesting question of how then do we invite the visitor to engage with us in this? we're thinking about that currently. And the easy way to answer that would be that we're exploring this in the course that's coming in the fall semester with students to think about what kinds of public programming might we envision to do this. I think we've also thought about having visitors share about their own spaces of conservation. I've heard that maybe this is just a conservator thing of of colleagues who, over the course of the pandemic, as they work from home, have taken to mending the things at home that are broken, and in those actions have sort of sought refuge in them. Might there be a way for us to introduce or create a space where we invite the public to similarly speak about, write about, or respond to how what is conservation to them? And so I think that those are all things that we're exploring. And sorry, I think I kind of rambled on there. Peter, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I think just a couple things. And we amongst ourselves use the term vernacular conservation to describe, the conservator at home gluing a soup bowl back together. In the office, so to speak, they might do it with a lot more high-tech equipment. So that's one way of thinking about it. It's also, you could think about it visually in terms of a continuum between the more and the less scientific approach to things. I don't know, thinking back to the question, I don't know that it's democratizing in the sense that, anyone can cook. Not everyone can be a conservator. You need training for it. And, as an educational institution, that's something that we believe in. But, and this is something I mentioned before, what is done professionally by conservators, I think can be more accessible to visitors once we make clear that what visitors have been doing at home and what all people do with heirlooms, with memories, is a form of conservation. That, like Moliere's character, we're all conservators, even if we don't know that that's the language we're speaking. And that's where I think the democratizing comes in. And I think Sunkai's point about how we're trying to develop pathways for visitors to interact with the experience. The mood boards are something that Sunkai has already mentioned. Students did a fantastic job. And, that's a way in which people experience this, that you don't have to be a synesthesiac to look at these objects and experience feelings about them. And those feelings won't be that different from how people feel about their own objects.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking, kind of in response to your response about this democratizing move, which is one of the questions that we encountered in our discussions were, who decides, and this question or notion of authority, particularly in an institutional context. And I think for especially indigenous materials, over the past decades, there has been more and more, and today it's become sort of the practice to seek out input from indigenous communities about the approach towards conserving their materials, right? And I don't think that's necessarily maybe democratizing isn't the right way to frame that, but I think increasingly conservators are going beyond, sort of stepping beyond the bounds of whose sort of views are considered in the conservation of things. And maybe that doesn't quite get us towards democracy, but I think it is moving or shifting in that direction. Kristen has a question. You mentioned how you and your students are thinking about how the objects will be displayed in the gallery. Could you elaborate on how the exhibition theme has or is affecting the traditional model of museum exhibitions? It strikes me that some of these examples of conservation and repair are not immediately apparent to a casual viewer. So what ways are you thinking of drawing out these themes through the use of the space. So I think on the one hand, the sort of perhaps lower lift might be to make apparent the accommodations or the decisions that have to be made with the display of some of these items, whether that is to show them in lower light levels, because we're required by the lending institution to do so, whether it is to maintain the galleries at a particular temperature and relative humidity, and to make a point of how we are doing that actively, and that is not an afterthought or invisible or hidden. So I think that's sort of the in some ways the easier way to do it. And of course also that there are items in exhibition such as the panel painting that I showed earlier, which has a microclimate, it's buffered against its surrounding environment, and because of its sensitivity to the environment, and to make a point again of those actions that have been taken to do this. But the question you ask about how do we make, oh, Peter.
I don't know, finish your thought, I'll come after.
Okay, well I think the question of how do we make apparent what is often not apparent is a good one. We've thought of, for example, exploring augmented reality applications to overlay or to show options for conservation, say, or to highlight aspects of the items that have been conserved. But I think there is something to the fact of showing these things as they are, and to point to either through textual or through other accompanying audiovisual applications, there are aspects of them that have been conserved, or to allow or to enable the visitor to learn to see as the conservator does. And so that I think is a more difficult thing to do, and yeah, I think it's something that we're still exploring, and we will continue to do as we enter the summer. Peter, you have something to
yeah, I would just say in response to Kristen's question, one of the things that we're thinking of doing is where we can, i.e. as much as possible, to include treatment reports as part of the labeling. So yeah, the normal labels, but to include extended parts with the treatment report. And the idea is, and it's going to be most extensively part of our kind of reality for the third part of the show on who conserves objects, is that objects have histories. The histories are not just of the making of the objects, but the conservation histories themselves, if exposed, call attention to a kind of exploded history of the object, that even when they're in an institution and supposedly at rest, they remain active through the workings of conservators. And that's part of the life of the object too. And that's the part, it's not just that the handiwork of the conservator is meant to vanish or be as little discerned as possible and only to trained eyes. And the display in museum rarely calls attention to those moments of conservation, but the whole history of the way an object is conserved, often multiple times in an institution that collects the object, is something that's submerged. And if you bring it out, it changes your whole perspective on the life course of objects and the role of institutions within them.
Great. We have another question from the audience, from Heather Galloway. As conservators, we're often valued by the academic world and the general public as a link between art and science. There are moments when this connection doesn't recognize that conservation is often performed with long-standing traditional tools and methods that were a continuation of domestic care and repair. We prefer to elevate the science, distancing ourselves from craft. Have your classes examine this at all? That's an excellent observation. Yeah, let me think about this. and perhaps, and this might my answer might not be satisfactory, but I think we've thought about this through, in some ways, the slippages that are revealed by the kinds of documentation that conservators generate about things. That when we write in a treatment report, such and such was performed, such and such was done, and owing to XYZ reason, it fails to convey in many ways the actions that sort of are more voluminous than the simple sentence describing it. And I think, to think back to what Peter just said about treatment reports and to Kristen's question, that is what we're hoping to draw out, which is to point out that the sort of description or these pseudo-objective writing about the histories or conservation histories of things can only do so much to help us think about a much richer biography of these items that involved, I think, the mind and the hand in a sort of more processual way. One thing that comes to mind is an article that we read, and in fact, actually, two examples that we read in class. I think one, an article by Jim Coddington in the Brooklyn Rail, where he describes sort of a good day in the life of a conservator and what it is like to consolidate flanking paint. Another in Salvador Munoz Viñas's book on swab cleaning a painted surface. And those descriptions or narrative descriptions of these conservation actions, I think, build out, again, sort of this distancing that tends to happen.
I would just add one thing to that. Though I realize this may be putting the cat amidst the pigeons, but this question of craft versus science is something that we've encountered often in the life of the project, not just the life of the exhibition. But we've encountered it. You're talking about the way conservators like to present themselves more on the science side than the craft side. But we see that in terms of the relations between conservators and conservation scientists and the tension that's often there. And sometimes it actually leads to the conservators emphasizing the craft side as a way of distinguishing themselves from the conservation scientists. So I think it's much more fluid than seeing it one as all good and the other as all bad. I think the context often plays a crucial role in which facet of the conservators' knowledge and ability is being emphasized.
Great.
I'm just jumping in over here. I'm Emily, you saw me at the beginning, to say we probably have time for one more question. And just to flag in the chat that Sun Kai actually had a really lovely conversation with Ellen Carley, who's a conservator. And a little bit of this question gets touched on in that podcast episode. So I just refer you to that if you're interested in listening to that conversation. But I think we have time for one more, if anyone has something that they are burning to ask.
I'll ask Sun Kai a question while we're waiting for the audience. And that's, Sun Kai, having done, you've got one more year on this project. Having done this, does it change your horizon of the future? When you think about the kind of career you want?
That is a difficult question. I think so, and I think in an interesting way, and maybe kind of coming back to the preceding question, and I guess as I'm saying this, I think it makes sense why I asked you this question earlier on about museums and institutions responding to this broader way of thinking about conservation and how that might happen. I think that something that we haven't really explored to its fullest potential in conservation practice, perhaps, has been that of publication, and to provide avenues and platforms for conservators to write about, to think about, and to share about the work that they do in sort of non-normative ways. So that's one area that I'm really eager to sort of pursue further. And in that sense, being here for the past almost 2 years now, and attending the wide variety of lectures and talks and events has made me aware of sort of a richer underlying narrative that I think conservators can contribute and be a part of that we aren't yet. So that in a very abstract way is how I thought of this. I think also, coming back to this notion of craft, that I think it'll be important for me to continue to work with my hands, to continue to conserve items, to continue to speak with artists, with scholars, with people. But I think ideally in a space where such conversations are encouraged. And I think that perhaps it's more of an ideal at the moment. But I think there's a lot of sort of possibility there. Yeah.
Well, I would like to, on behalf of everyone who's silent in the participant side, thank you both for the time and attention for this conversation. And to just flag that this is the first in a series. There's a second conversation happening on May 13th. That's the link to that is posted in the chat, with Hadley Jensen, who's curating an exhibition that will be a digital exhibition opening next spring, called Shaped by the Loom. So please join us if you'd like to return for that conversation in a couple of weeks. Thank you, Pita and Sunkai, and thank you everyone else, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everybody.